The Consulting Success podcast is powered by the Clarity Coaching Program. If you'd like to work directly with the Consulting Success team and receive personal coaching and support to optimize and grow your consulting business, marketing, and revenue, visit consultingsuccess.com to find out more and apply.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky, and welcome back to another episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have Phil Krichilsky. Phil, welcome.
Hi, nice to meet y'all.
Yeah. So I was really enjoying our conversation before we hit the record button here, getting to know kind of where you are in the world right now, being Hong Kong, but also just kind of hearing a little bit about your background. And I want us to dive a lot deeper into that because you've had quite a journey. You've been to many places around the world and conducted business in many places. But for those that aren't familiar with you, Phil, and your work, you are a turnaround specialist, right? You're a corporate director, you're an entrepreneur, and you have a real focus around East Asia. So you're the CEO of Innovative Directions, where you specialize in materials, apparel, and distribution inside of Asia. Anything to clarify on that? Was that an okay intro, or did I miss anything that we need to hit on?
It's a great intro. I mean, my background at the simplest level, I was born in New Jersey in the US, and I went into the military as an Army officer. I was an infantry officer.
Yeah.
Most of the work I did in the military, you're changing jobs every year and a half, was taking situations where things weren't performing optimally and making them perform better or helping them perform better. So in those leadership roles in that first 8 or 9 years, I led teams and helped develop them to be the top performing teams in our units. After that, I went to General Electric and W.R. Grace and a few other multinational companies over the next 20 plus years. And I never really changed my job. I always got thrown into difficult situations to fix them.
Mm-hmm.
At GE, my first job was a union distribution center. I had 80 really nice people who were so senior in the union, they would bid for these jobs so they could sit on forklifts and find ways not to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I was literally hired to help get everybody working again. And the problem we fundamentally had, we produced about $800 million in chemicals. We could not ship on time. We literally had an on-time fulfillment rate of less than 15%. And one of the driving factors was the warehouse decided what they wanted to ship when they wanted to ship it. So customers were getting frustrated. And my first role became fixing that. And on account of that, GE sent me for Six Sigma training. I became a black belt and then ultimately a master black belt. And I started running small commercial P&Ls. And over the next 10 years, GE, like the Army, keeps switching you. I started to do more turnaround, more inside consulting work.
Yeah.
I did that for almost 20 years, culminating in being a CEO and regional president for different multinational companies. Right. On that, I got onto boards, and even the board roles I took as the younger guy on boards was turnaround focus. About 10 years ago, again, third part of my career, I said, why wouldn't I just offer this service myself? And that's kind of what I've been doing. I do more interim CEO turnaround work today.
Okay. So thanks for that. And I want to take us back a little bit because you started off talking about your time in the Army. And that's something that I wanted to touch on a little bit because we've talked to many people over the years who have either been US, UK, somewhere in they've been in some army or some kind of military capacity, and they come out into the world, either corporate or they get involved in consulting. And I'm wondering, from your time inside of the military, what did you feel, or what do you still feel today, was most valuable or applicable to you? And if you were speaking to somebody else, regardless of where they're from in the world, but they have that military experience, what might you suggest that they shine a spotlight on or use from that experience that they might not be using today?
That's great. I mean, I think about that a lot because my son's a lieutenant in the Army now. To me, the great thing about the Army is purpose, direction, and boundaries. And if I forget these three, you can remind me. But anytime you're in a situation leading people, and the difference between the military and the civilian world is as a lieutenant, you're leading people at 22 years old. There's a goal. Attack Hill 543 at 2 o'clock in the morning, get the operating room working and do surgery, whatever it is, there's always a mission. I was a combat officer as an infantry guy, but you'd be given these operations orders. You'd have the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why.
Mm-hmm.
Applies every time you go. What that really says is, what's your purpose? So in the military, we had absolute purpose. Direction. I learned that early, and I think this applies very much to everything I do as a civilian. I discovered when I was lucky, I had 4 platoons. On my second platoon, I guess I never got it right. I put a calendar in front of the door, and I just sort of wrote what I knew we were going to be doing in the next 3 months. Direction totally applies in business, because if you're able to help people understand where they're going, it's easy to center them and make that purpose palatable within their terms. What works both in the military and in big corporations, like when I worked at General Electric, we spoke a common language. And it's easy for us, and especially in the soft world of consulting, it was theoretically soft. You have to find that common language. In the military, we're trained on the language. In GE, they did a breathtaking job of teaching us the GE language. What I'd say all of us on a podcast like this have in common, there's a finance language that we could and should speak that allows us to stay centered. So purpose and direction is really the 2 biggest things I got out of the military. And my third was, so I told you that.
No, well, you did a great job with those. And I think that actually really provides kind of the context that I'm looking for, or a bit more of that background. I wanted to also ask you, part of you talk about the time at GE and the certifications, or kind of going through black belt and kind of rising up through Six Sigma. How impactful, how much of the success that you've had today would you connect to that actual experience of going through those certifications and going through Six Sigma and that kind of training?
I think in the end, you sort of adjust to what your personality is good at. As most of the people who are probably listening to this have far deeper experience than I do. As I said from the beginning, I was an Army officer. My experience was broad. I wasn't the guy who could sniper at 2 miles out or set up an ambush line in 15 minutes like a sergeant who's been there 20 years. What I am is a generalist. And what Six Sigma did for me was, when Jack Welch implemented the program at GE, people didn't really understand it. And I was one of the first or early practitioners of commercial Six Sigma. Six Sigma makes total sense in a factory where you're trying to get zero mass balance. You buy 500,000 pounds of iron ore. You try to make sure you have 500,000 pounds of iron ore content in something. When it's done, you don't have any loss. I mean, you can measure all of that. You could statistically see if there's high variation in the outputs that you want. But when you're dealing with commercial Six Sigma, is a sales force effective? We did a project at Home Depot. Are they optimally running one of these operations they have? We did another project at Lowe's. Are they getting the sell-through they wanted? The data's there, but it's not necessarily statistically correct, nor is it necessarily accurate. So I got out of it on a broader scale. To answer your question, what was useful about the training is I applied it to me. And I realized most people couldn't speak the language. Right. Back then we had Six Sigma was the DMAIC process: define, measure, analyze, implement, and control. What I discovered at GE is it was awesome at define and implement. It screwed up, fix it. The guys did it. The problem is the guy would get promoted, so it wasn't in control, and it didn't, or girl didn't stay in control. It wasn't measured, and we didn't really always agree as to what the problem is. And I think everyone who listens to this would agree. A lot of times a client will say they have a problem and they don't really know what it is. So what I got out of the training, because it applied to me as a generalist, measure, analyze, control.
Got it.
On a broad basis, what training taught me was, and that's why I recommend it, apply it to yourself and find out how you can use it to make it common sense for others.
Phil, so in doing some research before we jumped on here, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and correct me if this is wrong, but it looks like you started your company, Innovative Directions, after coming out of the military. Is that correct? Or did you go right into G? Because from what I saw, it looked like you went in and you built the business up to over $1 million per year, and then things shifted after. I just want to first, because I have a question about that, if that's the case.
Good research. So that is true. When I was a lieutenant in the Army, or a captain in the Army, Berlin Wall came down, Cold War was over. America was in one of these phases where we thought we wouldn't be involved in any of that. So they started to tell us to use our free time and get more family time. This was my wife and I. She was working, so I started doing consulting on the side.
Okay. So my question for you then, based on that, is how did you go about getting clients for that business? I mean, here you are in the military. How do you, as somebody in the military, or even if you just left the military, where do those first few clients come from?
Yeah. And I encourage everybody to do it. You just got to start telling your friends and what you're working on and have them introduce you to their friends. And 90% of it is going to be wasted effort, other than a couple of good drinks and a few stories. But I started telling people what I was interested in. The three totally separate things happened at the same time. One, I met another West Point guy who got out and owned some McDonald's. He told me about a client that started a business that was successful idea, but failing. So I helped write his business plan and ultimately took it over, rebuilt it, turnaround, and made it pretty successful. Two, I had another West Point classmate who was working as a financial advisor. These are great guys to help you out, by the way. He had a client who took over his father's business that was struggling, and I wound up literally putting in an operational structure. And before there was a CRM, implementing a CRM, before there was scheduling software, creating scheduling. I didn't even know what the heck I was doing. I was literally making it up as I
went. Yeah.
On account of those, I started to get press written about me, and then people would call me up, and I probably did another half a dozen projects off that.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. Just to summarize, I mean, you started by leveraging your network, right? By connecting with people, telling them what you're up to. That led to introductions, referrals, that led to conversations led to business. And then something that you said right now, which is so important for those that are at the earlier stages, is that like you didn't have everything figured out. You didn't have the actual kind of systems in place that you would later really develop. You had probably an idea of what you were doing, hoping that you would be able to create a result. Probably, I'm guessing you maybe read a bunch of books. Like you had some knowledge and experience being in the military, but it's not like you had everything figured out before you launched your business. You launched your business and then figured things out. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say. And even another way of phrasing it, I almost fell into it. But one of the ladies' partners I have always reminds me, activity begets activity.
Mm-hmm.
But another takeaway neither of us said is you just can't sit still. You got to go knock on doors and talk to people. I could tell you when you're doing higher paid engagements, and we'll talk about my model later, sometimes it takes a few years to win something. So it's easy to, especially COVID taught us, to turn on Netflix and hang out at home. You can't. You got to go out, have coffee with people, have drinks, have dinner, talk about what you do, refine your elevator speech. And none of that will get you the work. It'll just get you comfortable with your conversation and watch how people react so that you could start to figure out how to hone what it is that you're offering.
Yeah, no, that's so important. We talk to clients about this all the time, that in the day and age that we're in, it's so easy to hide behind your computer and feel like you're being productive by creating a bunch of stuff and touching the keyboard. But if you're not actually engaging in conversations, whether that's on a phone call, Zoom call, in person, you're going to have a real hard time getting business. So taking that action is just so critical. So let's fast forward. So you got some clients through your connections. You did great work. That led to press. That led to more business. But then about 3 years in, you decide to close that business and to actually go into the corporate world, working with GE and other organizations. You actually end up, as you mentioned, rising up, becoming a kind of CEO and president of other companies. But why do you stop consulting? Kind of what was going on in your life, in your business, that made you decide, I have this business that's doing over $1 million per year. I'm going to give that up and go and work for other companies.
And I guess the first thing I say is none of us give anything up. I mean, you carry with you, for better or for worse, your experiences.
Mm-hmm.
As I look back, I've always been doing turnarounds. I've always been leading people.
Yeah.
My patience level sometimes isn't where it used to be, but my energy level isn't always the same. But I carry experiences that I use every step of the way. I would tell you, theoretically, it was for family reasons. Realistically, that's not what happened. I wound up doing exactly the same work in GE that I was doing for myself. And diversifying your experience gives you perspective. And I like that. I mean, I met some people like you who may be listening to this podcast who've done everything on their own every step of the way. I'm glad to know what it is to be in a corporation. I can relate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad to know what it is to work as an operating CEO or an operating general manager for private equity, because I can relate. So I wouldn't trade it. I would just tell you the path has been exactly the same. The direction of the path has been exactly the same. The specific trail has always been a little bit different.
Yeah. Is there anything now, kind of like looking back with the benefit of hindsight, that maybe you would have done differently along that path? And I'm kind of painting some broad brush strokes, but from the perspective of, you had this consulting business, you decided to make a change, go into the corporate world, do that for a period of time, then come back, start reignite that consulting business. Again, with hindsight, any adjustments or changes you would have made looking back now?
I'm going to answer it a little bit broader. I mean, again, with a son that's in the military, I would just tell you on a broad perspective, in anything that I did, I'd probably be a little bit more patient and a little bit more stubborn. And I'll explain both of those. Patience means just because things aren't exactly going where you want, you don't have to react. I mean, in a system like the corporate system, last man standing does work. If you're the only highly experienced person, they kind of do need you. In the military, last man standing, you're the guy with the experience. They do value that. So patience definitely pays off. I wasn't always patient. I kind of wish sometimes I was. Stubbornness is, a lot of people will convince you to do things that may not be good for you. I mean, I'll start with the military and then apply it to some other things. I got like the max test score for foreign languages back in the day because I cheated. I studied this fake language called Esperanto, which was the test. And in doing it, they wanted me to become a foreign areas officer. That absolutely would not have been the right move for me. But people will come to you and say, this is right for you, do it. We're going to move you in that direction. And you've got to decide really where it is you want to go and be stubborn about that, but be patient and wait it through. I'm not like some people that are an expert at closing lots of business. I'm very stubborn about what I'm willing to work on. I don't know if that's good or bad. The model's still very much under development. And we'll talk, like I said, I suspect we'll talk about it shortly.
Yeah.
But I do think patience and direction, patience and stubbornness to stay where you want to go matter. And I know the times I didn't do it, it did not pay off.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because one thing that I've been hearing about and just kind of thinking about as well recently is that humans tend to look for, let's say you create a successful business. It's very natural for people to think, okay, I have something that's going really well. Like, what else can I do that's different from what I'm doing right now? It's like almost like we need that dopamine or that new thrill or that change. And back to your whole patience thing, very often people have a good thing. They don't necessarily just stick with it and let it compound and let it grow. It's like, okay, it's good, but now they want something a little bit different. So that's like something that kind of the boring business or what's working for you. If you just stick with it and keep finding ways to improve it and make it enjoyable and structure it in a way that works for you, freedom, flexibility, like there's just so much value in that. And I think very often entrepreneurs, all of us tend to have a bit of that shiny object, like just looking for what's next, what's more exciting, where's there more opportunity. And in many cases, that can mean that we actually pull our attention away from what's already working for us. But any thoughts on that?
That's a good segue into something that I've learned. I mean, again, everyone listening to this really faces a choice. Me by myself, billing at my hours, what I'm going to call the supported team, and I'm going to come back to and define in more detail, or us building something bigger. Those are real decisions, but I think they all start with one thing that you touched upon. You really have to slow down a little bit and ask yourself, what are my skills? Just because you like shiny objects doesn't mean you lack focus. You could like shiny objects. Just know that's who you are. So as an example, so if I take the shiny object example, or a lack of patience sometimes in my case, what I started to learn was if I take an interim CEO role, I'm not coming in alone. I'm going to sign a contract. It's going to have a clear beginning and an end and a purpose and an outcome. And then I'm going to have the right, within the amount that I'm charging, within my retainer, to bring in people to help. So I have a partner on my team who has a lot more people development, leadership development, and we help provide what she calls scaffolding, right? We try to look at people's strengths and make sure the areas that are maybe perhaps deficit they're aware of them and they're built upon. I know sometimes I do the shiny object thing. So I have a couple people I work with who are more data oriented. I know I lack patience. So I have some people I work with that can stay in the room after I leave and hear what should have been listened to.
Right.
So I think it's perfectly fine to work alone. A lot of you will and do, but you should also try to find people who have skills that you don't and keep them next to you so you can kind of build out on it.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of focus on your strengths. Don't try and compensate for your weaknesses, but just recognize them and then adjust as necessary. Based on what you just said, so you go into these roles, and it sounds like, let's just take an example. You're getting paid $40,000 a month to have this interim CEO role or some kind of executive role, and the money doesn't matter what, up or down, whatever. But for many consultants, they would struggle, or they might wonder, how do you actually structure that so that from the buyer, the client's perspective, like they want you to come in, they want your brain fill. How do you present it in a way that that client or that company is okay with it not just being you, but you're essentially saying, I will come in and I'm going to be part of this, and here's the outcome we're going to create, but I'm bringing in a team. Have you found anything that helps you to position that in a light that the company feels very good about and ultimately accepts?
It's not easy. I mean, the biggest challenge in this industry is you're only as good as your billing hours. I have tried to challenge that model. I have not fully succeeded at it. I will keep challenging it until I don't think I'll ever.
And when you say challenge, what do you mean? Just can you define or explain a little bit more?
So people listening to this or will be listening to this that are billing $1,000 to $3,000 an hour for mediation, arbitration, ESG consulting, corporate social responsibility building. I mean, you guys, all of you have incredible skills. You're 9 miles deep, not even a mile deep, on how you get those sort of things done.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is you can only bill for the time that you have if it's just you. And that sort of holds you back. The challenge I'm trying to give it is, and this works more in turnaround, let's look at your structure and let's see who's not performing. If we move that person out and I take over that role, that's my retainer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying, and again, you're going to hear this pretty regularly. I'm trying to find a level of fairness, right? So now you're just swapping costs. The problem any of you or us have, whether you come in with friends and attack a project together or your own company and attack a project, the problem you have is the more people a client sees, the more they think they're paying, even if they're not paying. So you got to always realize that you're mostly, if not 100%, a discretionary cost, and you can't create the perception of being too expensive for clients that are sensitive to it. And a turnaround, they're assuredly sensitive. So I try to replace something or something on the staff that they're already spending money on. And then we try to calculate and figure out what it is that, because remember I said about Six Sigma measure, analyze, what it is they really want to get done and how we could share in the improvement.
Hey, it's Michael here, and we'll be right back to the podcast. But first, are you ready to grow, scale, and take your consulting business and marketing to the next level? If so, our Clarity Coaching program may be a great fit for you. You'll work with our experienced team to set up a strategic plan for your business and coach you step by step in areas like how to consistently attract more leads, develop a magnetic message that resonates with your ideal clients, strategically package and position your services, earn higher fees, win more proposals, and scale your business. To find out more about Clarity Coaching and apply, go to consultingsuccess.com and click on coaching.
Can you explain a little bit more about that model specifically? Because it sounds like you're getting kind of a base, which is your retainer, and that might be the equivalent of some executive senior role inside of the organization. But in order for you to then figure out that next component of your compensation, which it comes from an improvement, a cost decrease or profitability increase or whatever it might be, or growth, how do you arrive at that? Do you set with the kind of the company, if you guys keep doing what you're doing, here's the baseline. If we achieve X level of improvement, whatever metric you both agree to, then Y percentage of that is what we will take it, or
as simple as that. I mean, and then there's an adjustment that answers your earlier question. So step one is to come in preferably at a retainer or at some fixed cost. There's no surprises. A few minutes before this, I was on with some accountants talking about surprise billing. I don't like surprise billing. I don't do it to clients. Second is to find something that you think that matters to the client that you can drive improvement on and agree on a percentage of payment. You can cap it. You can bound it, you could put time on it, but what it does suddenly is it transforms working by the hour. If I could get you 20 million in growth and I get 10 million on it, I get $2 million. It isn't now we can go work on a $2 million project with a $50,000 retainer.
Right.
Great. Where it gets interesting, and I say to the client, let's say we're doing an exit. So we're going to get you profitable and we're going to sell your business and we're going to get 5 to 10% of it. It's not what a broker does. I'm not selling your business. I'm leading it through the sale. Let's just say we're doing 10% on it. Now, suddenly I say to the client, you'll pay for lawyers, accountants, everything else extra on that you were going to pay for anyway. If you and I can't agree on it, I have the right to hire my own people and pay for it myself. And you have to be careful on how you phrase it. But clients generally like that because if they want to control it, they pay for it. If you control it, pay for it. That's a fair deal.
Right. Got you. Okay. So what I'm hearing, just take two scenarios. So is there any kind of average or standard percentage that you look at? Meaning if you're going to improve something, is it 20%? Do you think about the percentages based on what the total is? Like, is it different if it's, let's say, a 10 million improvement that you're looking for compared to a 50 million improvement compared to a 5 million improvement? How do you think about that, Phil, in terms of arriving at that performance component of compensation?
You did it great. I mean, you essentially bound it with two things, and those are the critical things. It's risk and timing. If it's something you could do quickly at a low risk, the price is going to be very different than a high risk that'll take forever. And I'll warn you about forever. I took on a project that I hoped would take 2 years. COVID hit. I think I was an outside director for these companies for like 3 years, and then I took over And it took 3 years to execute the project. I didn't know what it would take, but that was super long. And then I'm still doing wind down work 2 years later. I'll adjust my billing and I'll talk about that in a second. The percentages will go anywhere from 5 to 20%. 20% is long range. You got to be careful about things that extend past a certain point. EBITDA has windfalls, for instance, built into it. So profit, if you're looking at it, you might have gotten lucky. The economy changed, a rule changed, and suddenly you're super profitable.
Right.
Exit tends to be a little nicer. The client gets paid, you get paid at work. So you got to find something that is bound by time, is risk adjusted, that all you feel. The private equity guys always, when I worked for them, called it aligned interest. You got to find that measurement that aligns everybody's interests, and you got to think through it. And you got to leave a clause in your contract where you guys can revisit if necessary. It's a bit of a high stakes game because you got to trust each other.
No, I mean, of course, I think anytime you're doing shares with clients all the time when they're thinking about doing performance types of arrangements or equity arrangements, it's typically not the kind of thing that you enter into right away unless you already feel a very good relationship and it's somebody that you really trust, because there's a lot of risk on both sides that are being taken here. One question I had for you on this. So let's say you're engaged for, it's going to take 2 years. They're paying you the retainer fee. And then there's the equity, or not the equity, but let's say the performance component of this. Does that kick in only once you've reached that milestone, which let's say takes 2 years? Or do you have any kind of structure in place that allows you to get some of that compensation? Let's just say the goal is to reach 10 million in new profitability, and it's going to take you 2 years to do that. Well, 1 year in, you're at, let's say, 5 million now, like improved profitability. Is there a structure for you to receive some compensation there, or do you have to wait until you've hit 10?
That's a great point. So I do issue pro forma invoices, pro forma earnout invoices. I do sometimes allow portions of it to be paid out, and I have done that in the past. So I don't like any surprises. So 2 things I do for my clients is I don't like a lot of reviews, but I do a quarterly review, almost like a board meeting. We'll have a slide that'll show how much, quote, we're in the money, because I don't want to debate that one. As I said earlier, I'll not only show what we're in the money, I'll show what the add backs are, the things that they paid for that don't go against my earnout. So there's never, there shouldn't be an argument.
Right.
And then I'll issue a pro forma invoice. And this is what I do that's really cool and really fair. So at my busiest, I might be getting paid to be on boards for a client. I might get a retainer. I might be getting special expenses to do other extra work. I might be doing a little bit of hourly work, and I'm still working on an earnout. So there's literally 5 invoices going at any time. So a client might wind up be paying, and I've had this happen, $70,000, $80,000 a month, all kinds of things. But what I do that isn't in a contract, as things taper down, I just start lowering my prices every step of the way.
Why do you do that? What's the mindset of doing that for you?
I'm doing wind down work, for instance. They don't need to be paying $50,000 a month. I drop it to 20. We've shut 3 out of 5 companies. We've sold them. They don't need to be paying for all those services. I don't need to have the discussion with them. I say, hey, FYI, that's done. I'm going to lower the invoice.
Right. What's the reaction when you do that? What's the reaction from the client?
Everybody's different. Some like, finally, and others are like, thank you very much. But at the end of the day, this is a really, really important point. You have to decide what your moral standards are. My moral standard, and it doesn't mean I don't accidentally do it, but my moral standard is, am I taking advantage of someone? That's mine. It doesn't mean you have to write that down or anything else, but I don't want to feel like I'm taking advantage.
No, I think that's so critical that you define your values and your morals and what the way that you want to operate. And everybody should be doing that so that like you just feel good about it, right? I mean, the last thing that any of us want to be having is to have these thoughts running wild in our minds, and they're hard to put down because they're just like, it's like you're doing something inside that you shouldn't be doing. It just doesn't jive with you, right? It's like when you have a bad client, the best thing that you can do is get rid of them because they're just weighing you down, and that energy really holds you back from working or finding or taking action that's going to allow you to create the real true ideal clients.
And it's painful. I mean, for the past couple of months, I've been doing more forensic accounting type work for a client, rebuilding some books, and it's horrendous work. And I'm definitely not charging market rate, but I'm not going to whine to the client. I think the client will accept any bill that I give. The client might not even realize that I'm not even billing for it. But at the end of the day, you've been fair to me, and I have to be fair to you. And you're going to have to find your standard in that one.
Yeah. So Phil, I want to ask you, because you've been in so many different turnaround situations. You go into organizations and you work your magic to find the different levers, right, that you can pull that are going to help to improve whatever metric the organization wants to improve. And so when you go into an organization, what do you typically look for? And I know there's a lot of variables because it depends on what the organization is, and are they selling chemicals? Are they selling whatever? But are there certain things that you feel are kind of across the board? Like, here's 2 or 3 things that I always look for. Could you just share what that might look like?
Yeah, I have a scope and a methodology. My scope is I generally prefer to stay in product-oriented companies. It doesn't matter if it's retail, consumer, or industrial. I like that area. That's scope sort of 1. Scope sort of 2 is I generally prefer $50 to $500 million because there's enough to squeeze. It doesn't mean I don't do smaller. Many of you will work by the hour. I personally don't like working by the hour. I have done it. So what I do is I make myself feel good. I'll charge a lower hourly rate, and I'll say, if I take it to where you want it, pay me a 50% bonus on what I build. So at least I can feel better about it. But I'll try to stay within a size. I'll try to stay within a product line, and I won't engage on something that I don't think I can fix. Figure. Those 3 scope things aside, when I go in, my methodology is kind of boring, and I argue with people about it all the time. The wonderful lady I work with that does the people development side says, you got to look at the people first. I argue that I don't. A lot of people I work with say, you got to work on growth. I'll argue that I don't do that either. I start fixed cost. And the reason I do is I want to pay bills, and these are underperforming businesses. It doesn't mean they're not great businesses and they don't have a great history and legacy. But somewhere along the line, too much is being spent. And business owners hate when I do it because I get rid of the office they have in Seoul, or I force them to no longer get the limousine picking them up at the airport every time. But I attack fixed first. What fixed does is it drives cash when I do it, and it lets me start to understand people. So by driving fixed costs, I have to understand the financial statements. By understanding the financial statements, I prioritize and I assign costs to owners. By doing that, I start to see how people work. Some people are 100% on board and saying, thank God. Some people are running in the opposite direction. Others are telling you why you can't do it, because in this part of the world, sadly, some people do steal and they're just trying to protect what they're working on. But fixed cost then allows me to work on the second thing, which is people. You start to understand who's rolling in the same direction, who rolls in their own direction, and that's perfectly fine. Who wants to roll and doesn't know how, and who needs to kind of leave and do something else.
Right.
So step 2 is people. Step 3, because I like product companies, is looking at productivity. I mean, half of the people listening to this are probably 1,000 times better at it than me. But if I see people sitting in a factory, and I can't help it, I always see that. If I see full waste bins, my eyes are like programmed for this stuff. If I see machines not producing a consistent output, I start working on that variable cost productivity, both in terms of labor and product. And then I work on sourcing in it. And somewhere along the line, I'll usually look for something in variable cost that isn't burdensome on the organization, because by now you've tired everybody out. You got to give them a couple of quick wins.
Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Yeah, I was working in a contract manufacturer for clothing. We make down and Gore-Tex jackets. The industry is very green. They want to measure your waste. We're running at about a 1.5% waste. I discovered 2 problems. Problem number 1, they're only measuring what you put on the cutting templates. They didn't measure the fact that they bought 1,000 yards of fabric and only used 600, and 40% was truly waste. So I started measuring it. But rather than attack things that were going to upset everybody, I realized we were running our patterns to 5 millimeters from the edge of the fabrics. I ran it to 1 millimeter. That saved $1 million in productivity because we used $1 million less fabric.
Got it.
Didn't cost anybody anything. They told me why we couldn't do it. They were nervous, but nervous and why we couldn't do it aside, nobody lost their jobs. Nobody had to work harder. I mean, it was just a minor change and a lot of money saved.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. Okay. So you're doing this great work for companies. You've shared a bit about the model, how you go about doing things, and the methodology behind it. How are you getting business these days? Is it referrals, the network? Are you involved in any kind of speaking? Like, just walk me through, how are you getting business today?
It's something that I need to improve on. The problem with the work that I've done, and I just said it to you earlier, you could be alone, you could be supported, but the problem in the first 2 business models is you're not out looking for business all the time. I was a CEO for somebody's company for almost 4 years. I couldn't breathe. I had no time. I was smart enough to hire partners of mine, if you will, general managers to help run businesses, but I still didn't really have any time. So What I'm trying to do now is say, work more as an executive chairman, put people in running things so I can go out and promote the business. That's how I'm trying to change my business.
Mm-hmm.
I have not cracked the code. I'm a member of 6 or 7 relatively useful organizations for this. I participate in senior advisory for different companies. I will start to do speaking engagements. I have not. I'm under a lot of pressure to start writing. I will start doing that. I don't do digital marketing. I will start doing that. I don't think any of that's going to get business. What I think it does is just get your name out there. I mean, ultimately, this type of work, when you're doing an engagement that's $5 to $10 million for somebody, you could do it if you're McKinsey and Alvarez Marcel, but if you're us, you're not getting those quickly.
Yeah.
It's going to happen at 10 o'clock at night. You're walking down the street like, oh, good to see you. I need your help. You just don't know when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So my goal is to get out there. My goal, I sit in probably the greatest market in the world of underutilized talent, people in their late 60s and above who are semi-retired with great skills not working, and people in their low 30s who are underpaid and doing really hard work.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the talent around me. It's just getting the word out.
Okay. I have some resources I'll share with you after we're done the call here that might help with that. But I think I want to ask you is, as you've been building this business, what's been the biggest challenge? What's kind of one thing just stands out for you that like it was really tough, but you got through it, or maybe you're still working through it?
It's not that it's bad. It's targeting and quickly closing the people that need our help. Every one of us on this call, as we refine our sales pitch, loves to tell people, look, I'm not a consultant. I'm here to solve your problems. All of us tell the exact same story in different words. If you're lucky, you don't have to say anything and they tell you that's what you do. But either way, we're in the business of, quote, solving problems. All of us have the same challenge. It's how do you accelerate that? How do you get people coming to you saying, we need your help? You saying, look, let's table it because I don't think I can help. Maybe go talk to Frank, but or I think I can help and let's talk about how we do it. So it's speeding that process up. What I want to do is, because I work on an uncapped model, right? It's different than most people. I try not to charge by the hour. What I want to do is run teams. And for me, that's what I think about every day is how do I deploy 3 great teams with wonderful CEOs and general managers with diverse experiences that can take clients' businesses to a level of profitability or exit that they never imagined.
Yeah.
I'm challenged by that every step of the way.
Got it.
So,
and how about personally? Has there been anything that's just been like impacted as you've been running this business from a personal kind of side of things? If there's anything that you can share that you've been kind of working through, or maybe adjustments that you've made that have helped you, that you've maybe just changed your schedule or you've adjusted how you've done things or anything from that side. The reason I'm asking, just out of it of context, Phil, is I think very often we talk about business, we talk about growth, we talk about like all these things, but I'm a big believer that the personal side is super important because I know days like where maybe I've had a little issue with my wife and I've gotten to a bit of a conversation. I've come to the office and like, it's hard for me to really focus the way that I'd like to because the relationship or something personal is on my mind or something happens with my kids or so just those kinds of things. And I find people don't talk about that maybe as much as we all could. So is there anything, maybe there's nothing, but if there is anything that you could share, I'd just love to hear kind of how you.
I have a problem. I play too much. And I don't mean that I run around and play. I mean that about 15 years ago, my running buddy, when I lived in Shanghai, ran a $7 billion company. And he says something, a Jordanian American. He says, listen, whenever I do something great, I give myself an award or reward.
Mm-hmm.
And I followed this ridiculous philosophy. So please don't write it down because anytime I finish something good, I give myself a reward. It might be something silly like a Rolex watch, but that's not actually where I've moved to. When I turned 50 as a reward for finishing something, I applied to and went and got a master's degree at Harvard. That was my reward. This past year, after finishing this big project, I'm an extremely experienced rock climber and outdoorsman. I don't know anything about horses and hunting. So I took a $2 an hour, I'm not lying, $2 an hour job. And I disappeared into the middle of nowhere for 3 months. This is probably why I'd like to figure out how to get more business because I'm gone. And I worked as a cowboy.
Wow. Love that.
And I mean,
what was that like, Phil? Don't leave us hanging. What was that experience like? 3 months?
Brutal, man. When you're
was it?
in your mid to late 50s and you're working with 20-year-old kids pulling 20 kg loads on top of mules that want to kick and bite you 50 kilometers from the nearest town. It's brutal work. I mean, you work 18-hour days and it's tough. Wow. There's a business aspect. I watched how they run their business and how they deal with seasonal employment and difficult customers. But business aside, to answer your question, You've got to reward yourself from time to time. Got to take experiences that broaden what you're doing. There's nothing I did as a cowboy that I don't think I'll apply now every day. Certainly the humility of realizing that you're not as strong or experienced than any of these kids is useful in business every day. Yeah. Climbing or going on a climbing trip, going back to school. I mean, I can't even describe in words how great it is to go back to school when you're in your 50s and work with 30-year-olds and learn the mentality.
Yeah.
It's spectacular. I mean, it applies to business every day. I realized that I went from individual to small team, and I want to build mid-sized team because I actually want to encourage it. I want one guy to work as a CEO, decide he wants to go disappear somewhere. I'll go take over as an executive chairman for a few months. They'll come back and I'll switch out with somebody else.
Yeah.
I would love to build that model. Reward yourself, give yourself time, create experiences that might seem irrelevant that in the end absolutely will be relevant.
All right. I love that. I think that's, the balance of like time to recharge, time to step away from just the busyness of work so you can come back refreshed. And I love that new experience. I definitely was not expecting you to say that you went off and became a cowboy. I thought you were going to say that you reward yourself by doing some kind of trek climbing, since that's what where you have some experience. But regardless, that's fantastic. So just a couple of questions before we wrap up, Phil. You have so much experience in, again, identifying like what dials to turn, what levers to pull to optimize businesses, turn growth around, and so forth. Is there a book that just stands out to you as one that you feel maybe a lot of people should read or could benefit from, even if they're not necessarily working with product businesses or in manufacturing, but just that if they have a better understanding of what to look for and how to optimize things, it could potentially benefit them, their business, and their clients?
I can say that 2/3 of the time I don't read and then I binge read. And that's one of my rewards too, if you will.
Yeah.
The 2 or 3 that kind of stick out are long ago, Good to Great, really was one of the early management books that sort of helped you think about it. I've read 5 or 6 in the same genre, but the principle's really useful. Although it's not about turnaround, I think A Random Walk Down Wall Street lets you look at money in a certain way that when you're working with clients, I always told you I start with fixed costs, which means I start with the financials.
Mm-hmm.
That broad look at the financials is useful and kind of a good way to zoom out. I apologize. You'll know the name. There's an old productivity book by an Israeli guy where he talks about Herbie on the production line. I can't think of the name.
Yeah, it'll come back later, but
some of you will definitely know it.
Yeah, if anyone remembers who that is, reach out to us, let us know. Post wherever you see this podcast, on YouTube, Spotify, wherever it is, leave that comment, let us know what that book is if it rings for you.
It's good because it helps you think about queuing and productivity. I work in a region. I started in China. I live Shanghai, Beijing, and then here. You got to find the regional books that tell the story of where you are. You and I were talking about Li Kai-shing here in Hong Kong. There's a really cool book called Red Roulette that talks about an entrepreneur who helped build the logistics around the airport in Beijing. I would strongly encourage you that as you work in an industry or a geography to find good books. If you work for Exxon, for instance, Hidden Empire is a great touch on it. So there's really good books relevant to the geography and or the industry that you're in.
Yeah.
I can't emphasize enough. That's 1/3 of my reading. You're not going to be an expert. You're not going to impress anybody, but you'll get a sense of where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. I remember when I was living in Japan and running the business over there, I was definitely trying to immerse myself in as many books about Japan and the history, the culture. Just all the different kinds of things, as well as the business, just to try and have some of that understanding. Not, as you said, that I'd be an expert. And I was certainly schooled by many Japanese people in conversations or over meals, but at least I had a sense. I could drop a name here or there or a location here and there. And that oftentimes would impress somebody, or it would just get them to feel like, oh, you understand what I'm actually saying. And so now they keep going, right? And it makes that conversation for both people a lot more enjoyable. All right, Phil, before we wrap up here, really important, I want to make sure that people can learn more about you and your company and see kind of everything that you have going on. What's the best place for them to go? Maybe the one website they should check out, or how can they learn more about you?
Easy enough, innovativedirections.com. We have an online form you could just reach us at, or just click and see who you could talk to on us. Would love to help. If you have any friends looking for turnaround work or want advice on it, I don't view anybody as competition. I think we're all in the same business of helping people. So always here if you need us.
Wonderful. We'll link all that up in the show notes. Phil, again, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.